At night in Oxford, it is not the college towers that are most visible, but the steam rising from the city's bathhouses. Down below, by the murky water, stoves smoke, boards crackle, and other people's laundry dries on hooks. In cramped rooms, bare shoulders, old scars, leg ulcers, and black marks from belts mingle with the smell of hot water, rancid fat, and sour wine. Somewhere above, in a tavern or a university cell, grown men read or retell satirical lines about Oxford baths, about how they supposedly wash not only bodies, but also consciences on schedule. By morning, the jokes turn into confident rumors that baths are just a cover for constant sin. Greetings to everyone listening to this analysis. Write in the comments which city and country you are watching this video from, and what you have heard about old city baths as places of hygiene, pleasure, or shame. I wish you a calm but attentive listening experience, because next we will talk about how poetic satire fed the myth of scheduled sin, while Oxford city books carefully recorded the hours of family visits, the names of adult clients, and fines for theft, revealing a completely different, bureaucratic layer of city life. The name Robert Gloucester is usually associated with a rhyming chronicle created between the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. He is an author who turns the history of England into a long chain of couplets that are understandable not only to clerics, but also to educated townspeople. He works not with dry dates, but with hints, proverbs, and urban horror stories. From this perspective, bathhouses are the perfect target, a place where adult bodies are exposed, where students, craftsmen, widows, and hired women mingle in a single damp, cramped space. In satire, it is enough to mention bathhouses, and the listener will fill in the rest of the picture themselves. For this satire to be credible, the city itself must be dirty and oppressive. 13th century Oxford is stone and wooden houses, cramped courtyards, sewage ditches, slaughterhouses, and tanneries. Stench and dampness fill the streets most of the year. Washing at home is expensive and inconvenient. Water spoils quickly, firewood costs money, and only the richest have separate rooms. For most adult townspeople, the bathhouse was the only place where they could clean the dirt and parasites from their skin, warm their aching joints, and wash old wounds. However, it was also easy to catch a new infection there if the water was changed infrequently and the vats were not cleaned properly. Bathhouses were not exotic, but a crude element of survival. In other English cities that are better documented, such as London, bathhouses are recorded in statutes as early as the late Middle Ages as a paid service with official owners, fees, and complaints from neighbors. Some of these places are indeed associated with prostitution, but the main function remains utilitarian: hot water, steam, food, and rest. Oxford operated on a similar model. City records mention bath attendants paying taxes, plots of land by the water rented out for baths, and fines for violating operating rules. While the poet painted a parodic picture, the scribe recorded the fees and lease terms. In the bathhouse books, not only the names of the customers are important, but also the time. The city stipulates that general male and female visits are staggered by the hour, with breaks in between for cleaning, and that separate family visits are only allowed on certain evenings and for an additional fee. The records look dry. The day, hour, number of adult visitors, sometimes a note about an extra charge for a separate room. What sounds like sin on a schedule in the poem becomes a service schedule in the document, an attempt to turn an uncontrollable flow of bodies into a manageable city service. A separate line in these books is for fines and complaints. When belts, wallets, and raincoats began to disappear frequently from the bathhouses, the magistrate saw not so much debauchery as a surge in petty crime. The records include the names of those caught stealing, the amounts of fines, and sometimes orders to temporarily close the bathhouse for poor supervision. For the city council, carnal sin remains a topic of sermons, but the minutes more often mention other things: fights between students and craftsmen, theft of clothing, use of old dirty water, which leads to an increase in complaints of skin diseases. Against this backdrop, Robert Gloucester's satire turns into an ambiguous document. In it, you can hear how the city laughs and fears its bathhouses, how easy it is to combine heat, naked adult bodies, and moral anxiety in one image. But at the same time, there is a growing number of books in which baths are described as objects of control: licenses, opening hours, tariffs, owners' surnames. The myth, fueled by poetry, claims that there is nothing but shame here, that it is enough to close the doors and the sin will disappear. The document reveals the urban logic. Bathhouses are a service that generates income, leads to theft, causes scandals, and therefore requires control, not a pretty ban. It is from this dichotomy that further conflict will arise. While poets and preachers repeat images of dirty steam and debauchery in vats, in the real Oxford Bathhouse book, a new column of complaints is growing about the theft of belongings from adult customers. A surge in thefts, rather than special sins, will force the magistrate to intervene more harshly than the moralists demanded, leading to a clash with the monastery, which insists on the complete closure of the baths. But before it comes to that, it will be necessary to take a closer look at the registers themselves. They will reveal more about fear, poverty, and violence than any verse about scheduled sin. When the magistrates finally begin to read the bathhouse books, they are least concerned with what poets call shame. Something else catches the eye: too many notes about missing purses, belts, and cloaks. The minutes of the meetings contain brief notes about the increase in thefts in the bathhouses, the owners' poor supervision of their servants, and the guards letting people out of the steam room with suspicious bundles. For the city council, this is no longer an image of sin, but a concrete hole in the order. In a place where adults are left without clothes, they are robbed of the last thing they can carry on their way home. Meanwhile, satirical verses about bathhouses continued to circulate within the walls of universities and monasteries. Robert Gloucester is quoted as a witness. If the poet mocked bathhouse attendants, then the establishments had long been marked as suspicious. Clergymen eagerly repeat the image of a steam room where naked adult bodies, wine, and lazy owners mix. These images echo the complaints of the monastery. In appeals to the magistrate, bathhouses are described as a constant temptation for parishioners, as a place that must be closed for the sake of souls. Bathhouse books paint a different picture. They list hours by day and church holiday, mornings for artisans, midday for university people, evenings for so-called family visits by adult relatives, for which they pay more. Separate columns contain notes about private rooms, extra charges for clean linen, and water changes. Between these lines are complaints about theft and fights. There is almost no documented debauchery. Rare notes about the arrest of a well-known prostitute or an adult man suspected of rape are recorded more as a risk to order than as an illustration of morality. The monastery demands the closure of bathhouses, citing sermons and poetry. The magistrate insists on practicality. Without bathhouses, the city will be left without the only cheap way to wash, treat skin diseases, and get rid of parasites. In memories of past epidemics, dirt and overcrowding were already associated with rashes and ulcers, and university rules sometimes directly advise adult students to visit bathhouses for health reasons. Refusing to use these establishments in order to combat general debauchery means consciously increasing the threats to the body, not reducing them. In order to avoid direct conflict with the monastery, the council changed the language of the dispute. Instead of discussing sin, it presented figures: the number of thefts, complaints about noise and smoke, and the amounts of fines. In this logic, Bathhouses were not a symbol of vice, but a city service that generated income but required stricter control. Thus, a compromise is born. The establishments are transferred to a licensing regime. They are officially allowed to operate on the condition that separate and family visiting hours are observed. A guard is constantly on duty in the dressing room, and lists of customers and complaints are kept. Violations are punished not with abstract condemnation, but with specific fines and temporary closure. The poet, laughing at scheduled sin, perpetuates the myth of bathhouses as a constant temptation. But at the same time, scribes and magistrates create another reality, one where bathhouses remain part of the urban infrastructure, subject to schedules, taxes, and guards. In this reality, adult visitors are seen not only as potential sinners, but also as bearers of wallets, tax bases, and complaints. It is this clash between satire and the registry that will prepare the final version of the Oxford decision. Not to close the baths under pressure from the monastery, but to force them to operate under such a layer of schedules and fines that the legend of continuous shame will cease to coincide with what is written in the city books. When magistrates begin to pore over the bathhouse books, they are least interested in what the poets joke about. Something else catches their eye: too frequent references to missing purses, belts, and cloaks. The minutes of the meetings record that thefts in bathhouses have become more frequent, that owners do not keep a close eye on their servants, and that guards let people out of the steam room with suspicious bundles. For the council, this is no longer an image of sin, but a specific hole in the system. In a place where adults are left without clothes and protection, the last thing they can take off is stolen from them. Meanwhile, Robert Gloucester's satire pushed the monastery. Lines about the mixing of naked bodies, wine, and lazy owners turned into an argument against the establishments themselves. In letters to the magistrate, bathhouses were described as a source of constant temptation, a space that could only be saved by complete closure. These complaints underpin sermons, but are hardly reflected in documents. Bathhouse books list hours for craftsmen, clerks, and so-called family visits by adult relatives, while a separate column neatly lists complaints about theft, fights, and noise. The first notable case after the introduction of licenses is not related to morals, but to an apprentice whose shifts suspiciously coincide with the disappearance of belts and wallets. The magistrate sees his name in the books, fines the owner, and expels the apprentice himself without staging a show trial so as not to fuel rumors. The act mentions only negligence and violation of the license terms. For the bathhouse owner, this is a blow to his wallet and a direct warning. The next wave of complaints may cost him not only money, but also the right to keep his house. The monastery does not back down, and again demands closure, linking any fight or injury in the steam room to the atmosphere of debauchery. But the council is already accustomed to operating not with images, but with articles. Baths are necessary for the city as the only cheap way to wash, treat skin diseases, and get rid of parasites. To give them up for the sake of fighting abstract shame means consciously increasing the risk of epidemics and outbreaks of disease. The new ordinances reinforce another line: mandatory separation of hours for men and women, a guard at the changing room, a ban on the sale of strong wine on the premises, and increased fines for theft and assault. Baths are being turned into a controlled city service rather than a nameless gray area. In later lists of poems on the same theme, new details appear. Mentions of payment for water, that a guard now sits at the door, and a clerk counts the people who have left the steam room. Satire adapts to reality. It laughs not only at sin, but also at the fact that it is supposedly distributed by the hour and recorded in a book. Nearby in the archive are licenses, lists of fines, and protocols where the word sin is almost never found, but there is much written about theft, beatings, nighttime peace, and taxes. Between the poems and these documents, a future compromise is born. The bathhouses remain, but they live under such a layer of schedules, guards, and registers that the loud myth of continuous shame increasingly fails to coincide with what is actually written in the city books. A compromise on paper does not mean that the struggle is over. For the monastery near Oxford, the city baths remain a convenient target in every tense period. As soon as there is a crop failure, an outbreak of disease, or a fight in the market, the familiar image emerges in sermons. Adults go to the baths in the evening, forget about prayer, spend money on excesses, and then, weakened, fall ill. There, the words of Robert Gloucester and his imitators are repeated as evidence that the city lives according to the schedule of sin. Rumors quickly link any misfortune to the baths because it is a place where adults voluntarily give up their clothes, classes, and languages mix, and thus the usual boundaries of control dissolve. It is not only the monastery that puts pressure on the magistrate. A triangle of power has already formed in Oxford: the university, the church houses, and the city council. Students and clerks use the baths themselves, but at the same time, they easily become the targets of moralistic attacks. Any noisy evening in the steam room can be presented as evidence of the degeneration of scholarly youth. The royal authorities periodically intervene in conflicts between the university and the townspeople, and the monastery tries to use the bathhouse as an example of moral decay in a town where there are already too many strangers and too much money. For the magistrate, this means that any mistake in the management of the bathhouses can be used against him in a larger political dispute. Therefore, after each high-profile incident, a serious fight, a heavy customer falling into a stone font, death from sudden fever, the council adds another thin layer of regulations. Maximum hours of operation during the dark hours of the day are introduced to reduce nighttime feasts in the steam room. The guard is given the right to refuse entry to overly drunk adults and is required to record any use of force in a logbook. The bathhouse regulations include provisions on decent behavior inside. Gambling, loud singing, and the sale of strong wine are prohibited. At the same time, penalties for violations are still formulated in terms of fines, the pillory, and temporary closure, rather than abstract sin. The city shows that it cares more about controlled noise and the absence of corpses at the doors than about the bathhouse steam conforming to monastic ideas of piety. Inside the baths themselves, it feels like gradual suffocation. The owners are forced to hang lists of rules on the door, which few people can read, but everyone knows from hearsay: no weapons, no shouting, no trading directly in the steam room. The attendants are accustomed not only to bringing buckets and towels, but also to keeping track of time, expelling those who stay longer than the paid hour, because any overstay is immediately linked to a license violation. For adult visitors, the habit of washing turns into a small supervisory procedure. They are counted at the entrance and exit, and sometimes their names are recorded if they pay on credit. Baths become part of urban discipline, just like the market and the bridge, rather than a separate, gray area where one can supposedly forget about all the rules. The monastery still demands closure, but the more documentation accumulates, the weaker its argument sounds to those who hold the keys to the city. Each new incriminating list has to be compared with ordinances, fine books, and licenses. There, you can see how many times the bathhouse actually appeared in cases of violence or prostitution among the adult population, and how many times in cases of theft, underpayment, and violation of the evening quiet hours. In most cases, the magistrate sees the bathhouse not as a source of unique shame, but as a normal point of concentration of risks that are easier to deal with through a guard and a register than through a ban. It is in this layer, between the irritated verse and the boring column of numbers, that the final form of the Oxford Compromise begins to emerge. The poet continues to feed the rumor that sin in bathhouses is distributed by days of the week and hours, like services in a temple. The monastery repeats this image because it is convenient for controlling the bodies of parishioners. It is easier to say, "It is always bad there," than to admit to a complex network of schedules and checks. But the city council increasingly ties the existence of bathhouses to ordinances, taxes, and responsibility to the crown for health and order within the city walls. In the next and final step of this story, it is precisely this logic, not piety or desire, but fear of disorder and epidemics, that finally cemented the model of licensed sin, in which shame exists in the imagination and in texts, while on paper, bathhouses appear as a regulated service with hours for family visits and scheduled guards at the door. Over time, bathhouses will become so deeply ingrained in the urban fabric that the idea of a complete ban will seem as absurd to the magistrate as the idea of closing the market forever. But the controversy surrounding them will not disappear. It will simply shift to another level. Where once people painted frightening images of naked bodies mingling in nighttime revelry, they will now talk about taxes, sanitation, and accountability to the royal authorities. The minutes of meetings will increasingly feature words about the public good, the health of the townspeople, and the need for controlled places to wash. The word sin will remain in sermons and poems, but in city records it will be replaced by phrases about violations of order and unpaid fines. By this time, Robert Gloucester will have long since become a convenient voice of the past. His lines will be rewritten, abridged, retold, with the most vivid images taken out of context. For some, he will remain a witness to moral decay, as if it were the poet who honestly told what the baths of the scholarly city had become. For others, he would be just another author who liked to exaggerate at the intersection of satire and moralizing. But neither group would keep in mind the bathhouse registers with columns of names, hours, and fines, where the word bathhouse is listed simply as an object of accounting next to the bridge, the mill, and the tavern. Inside the establishments themselves, the habit of living under supervision will become the norm. The guards at the doors will be changed as regularly as the depleted firewood in the stoves. The scribes attached to the bathhouses or the magistrate will learn to distinguish old books from new ones by their handwriting. The old ones still remember the days before licenses, when the records contained only rare names and amounts. The new ones are filled with notes about the hours of craftsmen, university people, family visits by adult relatives, about who was fined for shouting, who for fighting, who for trying to bring a knife into the steam room. Sometimes there are also complaints about the rudeness of the owner or the negligence of the servants, dry, brief, but still recognized by the document as evidence that the customer's body is not completely at the mercy of others. The monastery, accustomed to seeing bathhouses as a symbol of debauchery, will eventually be forced to shift its focus. It is impossible to completely abandon the old image. It is useful when it is necessary to remind the flock of the fragility of the soul. But every time the desire arises to demand a new ban, one has to confront one's horror stories with numbers. How many adults bathe per week? How many cases of violence per year are actually related to bathhouses? And how many to the street, the market, or the tavern? The numbers are stubborn. Bathhouses do not appear to be centers of decay, but rather one of many public spaces where human filth, literally and metaphorically, rises to the surface. For the city authorities, this becomes a convenient line of defense. The magistrate can show the royal envoys and church inspectors neat volumes with licenses, lists of fines, and copies of ordinances. There it is clear that bathhouses are subject to rules as carefully as the collection of bridge tolls or night patrols. In the eyes of external authorities, this turns the problem of morals into a problem of service management. If there are guards, if there are clear hours, if fines really go to the treasury, then the city is at least trying to keep the situation under control. In this logic, a complete ban no longer looks like a manifestation of piety, but rather an admission of one's own inability to manage what people need. Adult city dwellers are getting used to this dual reality. Everyone knows that in bathhouses, you can still encounter noise, dirty jokes, and intrusive people who do not respect other people's boundaries. But everyone also knows that there is a person standing behind the door whose name is written in the book, that the magistrate has leverage over the owners, and that several high-profile cases have already ended not with monastic tears, but with real fines and temporary closures. No one considers such measures to be fair in all cases. City punishments are rarely subtle, but the very fact that there is a disciplinary mechanism changes the feeling. The bathhouse ceases to be a pure shadow and becomes a place where the risk is at least partially described in the rules. Robert Gloucester, if he could look ahead, would see a strange picture. His satirical lines continue to be quoted, but more and more often in a hall where they discuss not a ban, but the size of the next collection. The poet feeds the imagination, the documents feed the city, and with each new generation, there is a temptation to choose one of two images. Either to cynically say that all the paperwork is just a screen for that very sin on schedule, or to naively assure oneself that licenses and guards have finally cleaned up the steam room. The archives do not confirm either of these extreme options. They only show the persistent work of many years spent translating screams, fights, and thefts into the language of articles, fines, and ordinances. In the end, it is particularly clear that the outcome was determined not by abstract forces, but by the decisions of specific people. The poet once chose to ridicule the city baths as a place where the flesh forgets shame, thereby giving the rumors a lasting form. Monastery abbots chose to use his images as an argument in the struggle for influence and control over the bodies of the townspeople. The magistrates chose to look not only at words, but also at the bathers' books, and turned the baths from a convenient target into an object of licensing. The owners chose to tolerate guards and registers for the right to continue stoking the stoves and heating the water. Adult visitors, in turn, chose to continue coming under these arches, accepting the suffocating mixture of heat, noise, risk, and control, because the alternative was often ice-cold water in a bucket or complete filth. Thus, the confession of this urban history boils down not to justifying or condemning bathhouses, but to understanding how a network of norms and fears forms around one type of service. The myth claims that there has always been only shame there, and that any hot steam inevitably leads to a fall. The document responds with columns of hours, lists of adult clients, fines for theft, complaints of rudeness and fights. Between them are living bodies wrapped in wet towels, and people at the doors who, for a fee or as part of their job, decide who to let in, who to kick out, what to write in the book, and what to leave in the shadows. It is in this gap that the true meaning of the formula, sin on schedule, is born. For some, it is a mockery of a city that supposedly tries to regulate what cannot be regulated. For others, it is an acknowledgement that even where it is convenient to talk about sin, the authorities are still forced to count money, hours, and names. The story of the Oxford Baths and Robert Gloucester ends not with the victory of the moralists or the triumph of debauchery, but with a tight, heavy compromise. The baths remain, but are forever bound by statutes, guards, and registers, and any new myth about shame must first pass through the door, above which hangs a sheet with the work schedule and the magistrate's sign.